according to what the society needs, win a war, and what individuals need. Wow. The decision, in short, markets are not compatible with a society that wants to manage the use of its resources to meet social demands and social needs. So the notion that a market is some magical mechanism, that we have to be governed by a market, is absurd, and in actuality, we don't permit that anyway. That's a rhetorical, ideological twist that is unrealistic and has never, in fact, governed how our economies work. Please keep that in mind the next time you hear some esteemed leader explain to you why we must do what the market wants, as if the market is that Bela Lugosi figure, marauding, that's an actor who played Frankenstein in our culture.
Boris Karloff.
Boris Karloff, and nobody other guy.
Dracula.
Lugosi.
Dracula. Lugosi to Dracula.
Oh, sorry, I'm confusing monsters. But you get the idea. Okay, so much for the usual updates. It is now my pleasure to introduce to you, on my left here, Yanis Varoufakis. He is the director. He is the director of the political economy program at the University of Athens, which I believe is the major intellectual and academic institution in that city, perhaps in that country. This is an unusual program. It's unusual to have a director like this of a program like that. Tells you one of the other problems Greece has, clearly, in the way it's allowing its intellectual life to go. So it's my pleasure. I've asked him to give us his sense of what all is transpiring in Greece and Europe these days. When he's done, I've asked him to take about 20, 25 minutes. Costas Panayotakis, who's another expert we've relied on about Greece, is going to respond to him, and then it'll be open for all of us to have questions, comments, as we see fit. Yanis.
Thank you, Rick. There's a good thing about crisis. It brings us together. So I'm very, very glad to be here. Thank you, Rick, for the invitation. I'm going to take my cue. I'm going to take my cue from Rick about markets, and blend it a bit with Greece. Whenever these days you read on the front page of USA Today, New York Times, The Guardian, wherever, the word Greece, just know that the issue is not Greece. The issue is a crumbling Eurozone. And Greece is a euphemism. Just like, as Rick was insinuating, actually not insinuating, saying, when you see journalists, academics, politicians waxing lyrical about the freedom of the market, what they are effectively talking about is about coercion that has very specific targets. And let me give you a very brief example that blends the two, Greece and market coercion. Juxtapose three different little cases. One, a few weeks ago, the IMF and the European Union imposed upon the Greek government something even this Greek government of ours was not willing to do. It did it, of course. And that is, effectively, A, to dismantle minimum wages. B, to tax the extreme poor through the electricity bill, because they couldn't even trust their own tax office to do it. So if you're below the Greek poverty line, and the Greek poverty line is much lower than the American poverty line, even though prices are higher, you didn't used to pay tax. There was a tax-free threshold of around 12,000 euros, $15,000. But now, if you own a tiny little hut, and you have zero income, or just subsistence wages, not even wages, euros and cents, then you pay a tax through the electricity bill. Now, my partner was paying our electricity bill the other day, and she noticed that there were women there who were asking for they were queuing up not to pay their electricity bill, but to have their electricity supply disconnected, simply because it was a question of what do you do with $50 dollars that you have? Do you pay for electricity, or do you go to the supermarket and get some basic foodstuffs? Okay, that's example number one. What is the argument behind dismantling the minimum wages? The argument behind that is that it will unleash creative forces because the labor market will be freed up and suddenly unemployment is going to fall as new jobs are being created by employers who are now prepared to hire people as a result of the fall in wages. So that's case one. Case two, again, with my partner, we were in Crete having a brilliant holiday in July. And we heard a story by a small-scale producer, organic farmer, farming as well as production of actually goat's meat, which is a specialty in Crete, and where the five-star hotels serve it at exorbitant prices to super rich Arabs, Americans, Germans, and Greeks who pay, wait for this, in some of those rooms, $1,500 a night. Now, the hotels in question purchase that goat's milk for 37 euros a kilogram. I won't translate into pounds now. 37, okay? And they import it from France, which is not renowned for its organic goat. If you go to Crete, there are goats everywhere. And they're all organic and organically fed because they're wild. And this guy that I'm referring you to had invested something like in the order of $500,000 in a production unit in order to supply at extremely competitive prices better quality organic goat meat to those five-star hotels. He was selling it for 9 instead of 37. He's bankrupt now because the wholesaler of foodstuffs, as well as the local authority that is implicated in giving him the permits for running his operation, effectively closed him down. They are the same people who own the import-export company that brings the French goat meat from France to Crete. There was no interest by free marketeers in what was going on there. Third example. You may have heard that Greece was given the opportunity to haircut part of its public debt a few weeks ago, or actually 10 days ago. It started in July, it was a small haircut, now it's become a bigger haircut. Eventually it will be decapitation. So this sounds like something that is positive because it's effectively a partial write-off of Greece's public debt. So if you have $1,000 worth of a Greek bond, suddenly, which matures soon, you are only going to get half of it. This is what the 50% haircut means, which sounds fine, given that the country cannot repay its debts and it is sinking without a trace, until you start scratching the surface. And you realize that since that agreement was started, even before it was started, 70% of Greek bonds that would be haircut have been purchased by hedge funds at 30 cents a dollar, paying 30% in order to get the 50%. And the Greek government, in order to secure this amazing deal for itself, has signed on the dotted line that it will sell Greek electricity company, Greek water authority, Greek railways, in order to give sweeteners, they call them, to the bankers' shop steward, a certain Mr. Dallara, who is representing the bankers' trades union, in inverted commas, so as to have their consent for this deal. Now that, again, is a market transaction. They go to the market and they buy these bonds So these three examples, I think, are a nice way of linking what Rick was saying with the Greek situation. But let's go back to the Greek situation. We know that there is something wrong with the world economy when Greece features in every headline everywhere. You know, I didn't used to be a Greek economist. I used to be an economist. Some people used to think that I was a decent economist. The vast majority thought that I was a charlatan, right? But I was an economist. Now I've become a Greek economist. Suddenly, I'm extreme. Rick told me that I can speak freely about what I am. And he said, Yanis, you can say you're a Marxist here. Okay, guys, I am a Marxist, right? But I'm an extremely bewildered Marxist. And let me tell you why I'm a bewildered Marxist. Because over the last 2 years, I've acquired a certain profile, starting in Greece, but primarily in Europe and outside Europe, for confronting the Greek socialist government in what it is that they've been doing over the last 2 years. And also generally participating in the debate on the Euro debacle. And why am I bewildered? Because the little papers that I concoct in the middle of the night suddenly get published in right-wing newspapers, like the Daily Telegraph in England, which I never used to touch when I lived in England, in case I get contaminated by its right-wingness. Okay? Now wait for this. One article I wrote, which I wrote to put it on my blog, and then eventually it was taken with my permission, and it was published in 7 different languages by UBS. UBS is a Swiss giant of a bank, in order to send it to their preferred clients. Existentialist crisis galore. Tomorrow, I've been invited to address the New York Federal Reserve. Don't tell anyone. What on earth is going on? The answer is, a new 1929 happened 3 years ago, and we are now around 1931, to put it bluntly. And this is why we're all here together. Because I suppose if 4 years ago, Rick, we were having a meeting like this, there would be about 10 people in this room. Okay? And we owe the crisis a debt of gratitude for bringing us together. But let me now bring the whole thing a little bit closer together, because I think Greece and the United States are intertwined in a way that most people don't understand. Look, people say to me that Greece has never been in the news as much, especially as a harbinger of crisis, as an indication that something wrong with the world, since the Trojan War. It's not true. It is not true. This is not the first time. It is the second time that a world calamity began in Athens. The first time was December 1944. It was the beginning of the Greek Civil War. And that was the beginning of the Cold War. Let me remind you, that was 6 months before the Cold War began in Berlin. Don't forget that the Truman Doctrine started for Greece. And it was a response to the Civil War in Greece. Now, to start as a tiny pipsqueak of a country, to start a global crisis once is bad luck. To start it twice, borders on the careless. But it's not accidental. I don't think it is accidental. In effect, and that's something that Rick has been talking about for years now, and so have all of us leftists, we are experiencing still the repercussions of the collapse of Bretton Woods in 1971, of the first post-war period. That first post-war period came into being as part and parcel of the Truman Doctrine, of the hegemonic model that the United States created worldwide. It was a magnificent model. I mean, unbelievable audacity to build a world economy on the basis of fixed exchange rates, and with the United States of America effectively recycling its own surpluses to Germany and to Japan in order to keep the whole thing going. Now, the problem is, of course, that at some point it couldn't do this anymore because it lost its surpluses. And then you had the 15th of August 1971 declaration by Nixon saying it's all over, guys. And then we went into a second phase. But before I go into the second phase, let me say that modern Greece was founded on that first phase. Greece was devastated by the civil war that I just mentioned. Half of its people effectively left the country. Either came to America, to Canada, to Australia, or went to the Soviet bloc. And the ones who stayed under an extremely repressive, right-wing, neo-fascist regime. But there was a mini-industrial revolution that started in the 50s in the form of the Marshall Plan, taking its cue from the Marshall Plan based on a paternalistic state. The same families had one brother was the minister, the other was the industrialist. Small number of industries, which nevertheless created a productive capacity in Greece which didn't exist before. And that transformed Greece. Farmers became part-time proletarians, and then full-time proletarians. And then those proletarians turned into petty bourgeois middle class. So the middle class, the middle of the distribution, started getting fatter and fatter as a result of that experience. And Greece was growing quite fast in the 50s and 60s. But because it was a paternalistic kind of capitalism, crony capitalism, and unable to operate without very strict protection by the state, when Bretton Woods collapsed, and you had what Paul Volcker very beautifully described in 1978 as the controlled disintegration of the world economy. These are his words, and I love him for them, because I could not improve upon them. Okay? And with the collapse of the latest phase of the Greek neo-fascist system, which was the Greek junta in 1967, 1974, the penchant that Greeks had for genuine freedom, not freedom of the market, but perhaps from the market, and from the colonels, and from the police, translated into a national project of entering Europe, simply because my father was a communist. He spent many years in prison. And he really wanted us to get into the European Union, even though he didn't trust it. He knew it was the concoction of oligopolies, and that it was in cahoots with NATO and all that, but he really wanted us to get into NATO because he didn't want to have to worry about the secret police anymore. And the European Union offered that prospect. It's not an insignificant contribution to one's life. And so we got into the European Union, what was called then the European Economic Community, but that meant the collapse of the industrial miracle of Greece, because it was incapable of sustaining the energy, the increase in energy prices following the oil crisis of 73, 79, and simultaneously the opening up of the borders, the elimination of tariffs and quotas, and the flood of goodies that came from Germany, effectively. Germany, Italy, France, but primarily Germany. So the factories were closed down and they were turned into warehouses, which simply rebadged German washing machines as Greek washing machines. Okay? At that point, what happened was this. A country which had very low private debt and very low public debt suddenly got into a crisis because it lost its productive capacity. And the only thing that we brought to the table of the European Union was our capacity to increase our indebtedness. We didn't bring like Ecuador oil or like Argentina soya beans. We brought our capacity to get a second mortgage, because we actually first mortgage, because most Greeks own their little huts. Okay? And so that was a social contract between Greece and Europe. We get in and we start buying their stuff on the basis of loans. So the rise in public debt in Greece and the steady rise in private debt were not accidents or failures of the Greek state in its association with the European common market at the time. They were designed to be that way. It was the only way we could have been allowed in. The only thing we were bringing to the table. And the condition for getting in was that we destroy our productive capacity, both in the agricultural sector. The common agricultural policy was paying farmers to uproot trees, because that's what the common agricultural policy does in Europe. And at the same time, banning the Greek state from protecting whatever industry was left. So it collapsed. So we had a spending boom based on loans. Now, that was a time when the second post-war phase had been put into place from this place, from the United States. And what was the very simple idea? That instead of having the United States being the hegemon on the basis of recycling its own surpluses around the world, it remained the hegemon by recycling other people's surpluses through the deficit. The deficit was operating like a huge vacuum cleaner that was sucking the net exports of Germany, of Japan, later of China. And how were these being financed? By having the Germans, the Japanese, and the Chinese voluntarily want to send their money, their profits, their surpluses, their financial profits, financialized profits, surpluses, to Wall Street. Why? Because better returns were being made here for reasons that Rick has explained to you a lot better than I can in the space of time I have. Because of the increasing inequality in the United States, the fact that the working class was being squeezed beyond belief so that inflation was lower here than it was in Europe and in Japan, for reasons that we all understand, you understand better than anybody else. Okay. So a tsunami of capital was flowing across both oceans, the Atlantic and the Pacific, to New York, to Wall Street, to finance the increasing deficit, which was keeping this unsteady, unbalanced equilibrium, nevertheless, the great moderation, which was exactly the opposite, going. Why am I telling you all this? Because, two reasons. Firstly, because on the back of this tsunami of capital, we had financialization. And financialization effectively meant that the banks, starting in Wall Street, but very quickly moving to Frankfurt and Paris, and of course the city of London, started printing their own money. They're also known as toxic derivatives. It's private money. They were minting it. And those oceans of liquidity were pushing interest rates down and making it effectively a predatory loaning system for countries like Greece. Countries that had been depleted of their productive capacity were suddenly being faced with cheap money. And cheap money, just like prior to 2008, the bankers would force you to take credit cards. They would send them to you in the mail even when you hadn't ordered one. Or even when you didn't want one. Right? Similarly, they were doing the same thing with the Greek state, with the Italian state, with the Spanish state. Just like they were doing in the 1970s and with the Third World, which caused the Third World debt crisis. Okay? But there is something else. In Europe, we have our own contradictions, which are now, having created the common currency area known as the euro, are taking the level of the crisis onto a higher order of magnitude, one that has never been seen before in the history of global capitalism. Let me give you a very simple example. We heard today, and you keep hearing from Rick and from others, about the state of American capitalism. It is verging towards the depression. But no one is worrying, rightly so, about the prospects of a disintegration of the dollar zone, also known as the United States of America. You may get into a depression like the 30s, but I don't think anybody is worried that the United States of America will cease to exist. Rightly so, it won't. $1 in Nevada, in a bank there in Las Vegas, has exactly the same expected value as $1 in New York. That is not true in the European Union at the moment. €1, it's the same currency. €1 in a Greek bank account has a lower real value compared to a euro in an Italian bank account, and that euro has a lower expected value than a euro in a Parisian or a Frankfurt bank account, which means we have a Europe which is in an advanced state of disintegration. It is collapsing. And that is very significant, and it is linked to the United States of America. Because, of course, we Europeans have to blame it onto the United States. And I do. Because the Eurozone was created on the assumption that the vacuum cleaner that I referred to before would keep going forever. That Germany would have aggressive net exports increasing constantly, courtesy of the United States of America deficit, which was, until 2008, creating the aggregate demand, the real demand for those exports, either directly, Americans buying German goods, or indirectly, by creating the demand in other countries so that those other countries would buy German goods, including China. This was their presumption. The presumption was that, effectively, what Germany was, Germany had a big crisis with reunification. The model of German capitalism that emerged from the Bretton Woods era, which is a very simple model. When you think models, don't think mathematics, economics. It's very simple. It's a very simple idea. We have two pillars. The first pillar is the mark. The Deutschmark, which is strong, a Bundesbank, a central bank in Germany that keeps it strong and doesn't allow politicians, democratic processes, citizens to mess with the value of the currency. And the second plank, the second pylon on which the German miracle was created was aggressive exports. Now, the aggressive exports were creating the demand that was necessary within Germany in order to keep German capitalism going and German corporatism going. This quasi-cozy relationship between official trade unions and bosses. When reunification took place, and that sort of created a number of problems, I don't want to get into this very much, but all I'm going to say is that the way that Germany reacted to this was by having a corporatist social contract between bosses and official trade unions, which was very simple. The labor share of national income would shrink, but unemployment would be eliminated. And that was done through labor hoarding. Factories would not dismiss workers, they would take on new workers, even if they were not being utilized to the full, okay, feather bedding, whatever, and their wages would be squashed, but everybody's wages. So this is why now in Germany you have 2.5 times the number of working poor people than you had 15 years ago. 2.5 times. This is the reason why the neo-Nazis in Germany are rising up. They don't appear to themselves, they don't appear to the world as Jew haters, they're becoming Greek haters. Right? But it's exactly the same thing. It doesn't matter. We need a scapegoat. Let me now say this, that during this period of squeezing wages in Germany, this squeeze in wages in Germany aided and abetted what Wall Street was doing, which was to squeeze interest rates. Because by squeezing labor costs in Germany, interest rates in the whole of Europe were being squashed. And that fueled even further Greek indebtedness. Because when you have two countries locked together with a common currency, not a fixed exchange rate, same currency in your pockets, okay? Up until we did that and we created the euro, the way that the system was adjusting itself was through devaluation. So when Greek factories, Greek businesses were losing competitiveness relative to the German ones, the drachma would slide constantly. The Italian lira would slide, and then the little fiats would still remain competitive in Germany, and Germany hated that. So that's why Germany wanted the euro. Germany wanted the euro so as not to have to worry about fiats, and not to have to worry about the price of Volkswagen gearboxes built in Portugal, which would then have to be brought back to Germany and screwed onto a Volkswagen car made in Germany. They didn't want to have to worry about these exchange rate fluctuations. But the Germans are not to blame for the euro. The blame has to go to the French. Why the French? Because the French ruling class, since the 19th century, since Louis Bonaparte, was interested in one thing: how to forge an alliance with Prussia to defeat the French working class. It is very simple. The reason why the French wanted to get into the euro and to share the Deutschmark was in order to destroy the French trade unions, which they did. And the reason why they are now extremely worried about the disintegration of the euro is that they know that Berlin will not take them along in the new currency that Germany is going to form, and then they will have to deal again with a possibly resurgent working class in France. So they formed the euro. And it was essential to them that Italy comes in, because Germany was quite happy to let the Deutschmark destroy the French working class, as long as it doesn't have to compete with northern Italy, with the devaluations of northern Italian industrial goods, which are actually very good industrial goods, and which are extremely competitive with the German ones. So they had to bring Italy in. Now, Italy had a very large debt, 120, 110, 120% of GDP. Now, the Germans, in order to placate their own bankers and so on, said, oh no, 60% is the maximum. But then they had to turn a blind eye to Italy, because otherwise, how would they bring Italy in? People ask me, why did Greece get in? Did they lie about their figures? Garbage. Of course we lied about the figures. But we are not that inventive. Do you know what we did? And I can give you names, addresses, emails of the people who did it. They're friends of mine. Okay? And they've told me. That's how I know. I mean, I didn't have to discover it. It's not a conspiracy theory. My friends, fellow economists who were then policymakers, told me what they did. They went to Rome and found out what the Italians were doing. And they copied it. That's it. And then, in the meetings in the European Union, this friend of mine that I'm referring to, I won't say, mention a name now, but I can, yeah, I have it. He said to me that when the Germans were saying, oh, but we'll get the Italians in, but not the Greeks, you know. He said, okay, if you don't get us in, if you don't let us in, we will tell the world what the Italians did to get in. So we're in. It's very simple. So, let me just wrap up so that we can have a nice conversation after this. Europe is to the world that which Greece is to Europe. A problem. And the reason why Europe is a problem at the moment is because it has concocted a common currency, the purpose of which is to deal with particular class conflicts within the Eurozone in a manner that cannot be squared up with the interests of European capital. So European capitalism is at odds with itself. And it doesn't know what to do. This is why they don't know what to do. It's not because they're stupid people. Now, I think that we can have a New Deal for Europe. We can have a Roosevelt for Europe. Not that we have one, but we could have a Roosevelt-like approach to Europe now. And this is a proposal that I've been working on for a while, which would create the foundations for Europe without going federal, because that will never happen before everything collapses. Federation takes time. It would allow this crisis, the European part of the crisis, to melt away while the global crisis, of course, continues. They won't do it, though, because capitalism is notorious for the fact that it is just as divided as the left is. They are just more clever than we are, and they have a lot more money in order to portray their divisions in a better light. But at the moment, I'll tell you, there are industrialists in Germany that are picking up the phone every 5 minutes and saying to Angela Merkel, what on earth are you doing, woman? And then there are bankers who say, carry on. Because the interests of Deutsche Bank are not the same as the interests of Krupp Thyssen. The industrialists who make things do not want to see the euro go because they will lose China. The bankers are bankrupt. They've been bankrupt since 2008, and Europe is worse than America in covering up for the bankers' insolvency. So this is where we are caught in between a rock and a hard place in Europe. Greece is such a convenient topic of conversation. When you really don't want to talk as an opinion maker, a member of the elite, a politician, about the bankrupt banks. And about the fact that this is an architecture which was never designed to sustain a crisis. It's like building a building which has no foundations. And then the crisis comes and starts crumbling. And then the question is, do you inject cement into the foundations to solidify it, or do you let it crumble and fall? And at the moment, I see nothing that gives me any hope that it won't fall. Then, and I'll finish on this, Rick. Why not let it fall? It was an awful concoction. Well, I'm one of those people who in the 1990s was writing articles against the euro. But it's one thing to say we shouldn't have gotten ourselves into the euro. It's quite another to say we should get out of it. Because of what we call irreversibilities. If we hadn't been in the euro, life would have been far better for every Greek person except for those who actually profit from the crisis. For every German person, for every French person. Now that we are in it, if we allow, or when we allow, the euro to collapse, we are going to enter a postmodern 1930s. And let me tell you very quickly why this will happen. Because the process is going to be anarchic, the process of disintegration. Already, Greece has no reserves. Nothing in reserve, no fat. We've burned all our fat, and we've burned our muscle. And whereas we should be preserving ourselves for the hit of the collapse of the euro, because that's when we are really going to suffer, now we are comatose already. So it's like bashing a comatose patient. This is what the collapse of the euro will be. Moreover, when the Germans recreate their own currency and they form a new Lebensraum, a new vital space, with the other surplus countries, plus Slovakia, plus all the other ex-socialist countries which have been fused into the German industrial machinery, their currency is going to outpace the Swiss franc. They will lose markets. The working poor are going to become poor and unemployed. The social fabric of Germany, of Holland, which is extremely indebted at the private level, households, firms are extremely indebted in Holland. When that blows up, there is going to be blood on the streets. And we know what happens when Germany and its surrounding areas enter a huge depression as a result of a collapsing currency or a deflationary situation, while the rest of Europe enters a period of stagflation, combination of inflation and unemployment. Now, with the situation in the United States being what it is today, when this happens in Europe, we're talking about a global freefall. And I'm afraid that you and I are not going to be the ones whose voices are going to be heard louder and clearer during that freefall. The only people who benefit out of a freefall of that sort are the xenophobes, the racists, and the Nazis. Thank you.
I've asked Costas Panayotakis, a fellow New Yorker, to give some sort of response as a person who's also very well informed about the situation in Greece. But the purpose of that is to begin a conversation, to welcome you to raise questions and comments to any or all of us or to one another at that point. So Costas, if you take a few minutes and respond, would be interesting, especially with the conclusion, which I can see many of you are now trying to digest.
Yeah, it's my pleasure to, respond to Yanis. I've learned a lot from his interventions in the public debate. And just as I have learned from Rick,